Have you ever sat there staring at your phone, wondering why someone who once held your heart so tightly can now vanish like you never existed? If you're watching this, chances are you're caught in the stormy aftermath of being left by an avoidant. Someone who ran when things got too close, and now you're left holding all the pieces. Hi, I'm Jim Rohn, and in this video we're going to challenge one of the biggest myths in modern relationships, that avoidants never come back. The truth? They do, but not in the way you think. And certainly not unless you understand what truly pulls them back in. Not manipulation, not begging, but something far deeper, something psychological. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. You see, avoidants aren't heartless. They're guarded, emotionally self-protective. They crave intimacy but are terrified of it at the same time. So when they disappear, it's not always rejection. Sometimes it's their defense system on overload. The real question is, can you flip that switch? Can you break through the wall they built? This video will reveal what most people never understand about avoidant attachment and how to shift the dynamic without chasing, without pleading, and without losing yourself in the process. By the end, you'll have clarity, power, and possibly even a roadmap to a return, if that's truly what you want. But listen, before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because here, we don't chase love, we understand it. And if this resonates, if you've ever felt ghosted, ignored, or abandoned by someone you loved, this video is going to feel like a light in the dark. Let's begin. There's something profoundly confusing about the way avoidants detach. One minute you're holding hands and making memories, and the next it's like you've been erased. Not because they don't care, but because their emotional operating system is built to prioritize distance over confrontation. When an avoidant leaves, it's rarely about you. It's about the panic that closeness ignites within them. They don't disappear because they're heartless. They disappear because facing emotional accountability feels overwhelming, even unsafe. And here's the kicker, it's not that they're unaffected. It's that they delay the emotional hit. Where others feel grief immediately, avoidants defer it, sometimes for weeks, months, or even years. They move forward as if nothing happened. At least, on the outside, this disconnect can make you feel invisible. But what's truly happening beneath their silence is not emotional absence, it's emotional suppression. That's why their reactions seem out of sync. Their nervous system is conditioned to keep pain locked away until it's safe to feel it, usually in solitude, when you're no longer a source of emotional pressure. Most avoidants didn't just become that way. They were shaped by early environments where expressing needs led to rejection or chaos. To survive, they taught themselves to need less, feel less, and expect nothing. Over time, this becomes their template for connection. Stay in control by staying distant. But here's where it gets interesting. Emotional closeness doesn't just scare them, it threatens their core identity. So when they care about someone deeply, their instinct is to run, not because love repels them, but because it wakes up an internal alarm that screams, "This is dangerous." When the relationship ends, their calm facade isn't peace. It's avoidance doing what it does best, shielding them from immediate pain. But silence isn't healing. And eventually, when distractions wear thin and their life quiets down, that buried emotional residue begins to rise. Regret shows up, memories echo, and suddenly, they're the ones thinking about you, quietly, obsessively. If you've ever wondered whether your avoidant ex truly felt something, if they ever think about you now, the answer might surprise you. But to know why and what really pulls them back, you'll want to stay right here. There comes a moment, often when the world has finally gone quiet, when the avoidance starts to replay everything, not through the anxious lens of fear and suffocation, but through the haunting silence of what's no longer there. And in that moment, something inside them shifts. They stop focusing on why they left and start to feel what they lost. The very connection they once pushed away begins to take on a different weight, a different shape. The moments that once felt overwhelming begin to glow with a soft pain, because now they are unreachable. That's the cruel irony of avoidance. It postpones pain, not prevents it, and when it finally comes, it's not subtle. It crashes, all at once. Memories once buried resurface, not as threats, but as longing. The laugh they used to hear, the texts they no longer get, the touch that once felt too close now feels too far. What once felt like freedom begins to feel like absence. But by the time they let themselves feel, the person on the other side has often grown tired, or worse, grown, moved on, healed. And here's where the spiral begins for the avoidant. They are left staring at the space they created, only now realizing it's a space they no longer know how to fill. What's even harder is that this pain doesn't come with a roadmap, because avoidants rarely talk about it. They suffer quietly, privately, and often in shame. Their nervous system delayed the grief, but not the gravity, and when it finally hits, it's unfiltered. No emotional armor, no defense mechanisms to soften the blow, just raw recognition of what could have been and what may no longer be possible. Now, let's pause. Because if you're the anxious partner in this dynamic, you might already be nodding. You've felt this. You've chased, you've texted, you've tried harder, pushed more, believing that if you just showed enough, they'd come back. But here's the truth most don't tell you. Every time you pursue them in the panic of abandonment, you confirm their greatest fear, that closeness equals loss of self. This is the psychological loop that keeps both sides stuck. The anxious partner, desperate for validation, reaches out again and again, not out of manipulation, but survival. Silence feels like punishment, like proof of not being enough. But to the avoidant, that very outreach feels invasive, proof that connection equals chaos, and so they back away even further. You see what's happening here? The more you reach, the more they retreat. The more they retreat, the more you ache. That's not just miscommunication, that's trauma reenactment. Most people think they can fix this by loving harder, texting longer, proving loyalty. But no amount of doing will break this cycle, because it's not a doing problem. It's a nervous system mismatch. It's emotional reflex versus emotional protection. And unless both partners learn to regulate, reflect, and pause the impulse to react, they'll just keep spinning in opposite directions. And that's the trap. One partner fights to feel safe through closeness, the other fights to feel safe by escaping it. Two nervous systems both trying to survive, accidentally confirming each other's worst fears. So if you're asking, will my avoidant ever come back? The real question might be, will they allow themselves to feel enough to return? Because it's not just about missing you. It's about confronting the parts of themselves they've spent a lifetime trying to outrun. And that journey is never on your timeline. But understanding it, that's your first step to freedom. Stay with me, because what I'm about to share next will change how you see everything. The instinct to chase someone who's pulling away feels almost irresistible, especially when your heart is on the line. But what if I told you that chasing doesn't just fail to bring them closer, it actually pushes them further away? For someone with an avoidant attachment style, pursuit often signals something much deeper than affection. It reads as instability. It feels like pressure. And to a person who clings to control, space, and emotional self-regulation as lifelines, that pressure becomes unbearable. Your reaching, though well-intentioned, ends up confirming their greatest fear. That closeness will demand more than they can give, and that intimacy means emotional engulfment. So they do what they've always done. They disconnect, they disappear, they pull back even harder, and just like that, the dynamic shifts into a painful paradox. The more you try to prove your worth, the more invisible you become. The more you reach for reassurance, the more you're met with silence. It's not because you're not enough. It's because the mechanism they use to feel safe gets activated when they feel too seen, too needed, too emotionally cornered. And here's the trap no one warns you about. Chasing someone who's avoidant hands over your emotional power. You place your sense of stability in their hands. You make their reactions or lack thereof your barometer for self-worth. That's not love. That's a silent surrender of your core. And the only way out is through. Reclaiming your center. Taking your power back means stepping away from the cycle entirely. It means recognizing a truth that may be hard to swallow. Love can't be earned by convincing. It can't be bargained for. It must be freely chosen. And if you ever want the dynamic to shift, you have to be the one who stops feeding into it. Not as a game, not as a trick, but from a place of genuine growth. This doesn't mean giving the silent treatment. It doesn't mean disappearing in hopes they'll come running. It means you begin to center yourself deeply. You begin to heal, to build boundaries, to regulate your own nervous system so that your peace is no longer dictated by someone else's avoidance. And here's where something incredible happens. When you stop chasing, you stop confirming their unconscious belief that love equals entrapment. Instead, you become something both unfamiliar and compelling to them. Emotionally independent. That shakes their reality more than any text ever could. You disrupt the pattern they've relied on. You create space not just between you and them, but within yourself. And that space becomes your strength. It's in that stillness that clarity returns. It's where your dignity is no longer up for negotiation, where your worth isn't on trial in their silence. And yes, it doesn't guarantee they'll come back, but it guarantees something even more important, that you will come back to yourself. And ironically, that's often when the power begins to shift. Because real influence doesn't come from controlling someone else's actions. It comes from mastering your own. Chasing is rooted in fear. Letting go is rooted in strength. And in that strength, you stop being the one who begs for connection. You become the one who chooses peace over panic, self-respect over self-abandonment, and reality over fantasy. At the end of the day, chasing never gets you closer to love. It only pulls you further from yourself. The real impact doesn't come from your presence, it comes from your absence. And that absence, when grounded in dignity, not bitterness, holds a mirror so powerful it can change the entire dynamic. But only when you're brave enough to step away. Not to punish, but to rise. And that, right there, is where healing begins. There's something profoundly powerful about absence. Something words often fail to capture. It shifts the emotional landscape in ways that presence, no matter how consistent, simply can't. When someone is always available, physically, emotionally, or energetically, it becomes easy, almost inevitable, for their presence to fade into the background. Not out of malice, but through familiarity. The mind, in its brilliance, begins to normalize what's constant. It adapts. It tunes out. Psychologists call this hedonic adaptation, the idea that even the most valuable things lose their emotional impact when they're always within reach. So when your emotional presence is unwavering, when you're always checking in, always responding, always offering reassurance, it begins to lose its signal. Not because it isn't meaningful, but because it's expected. And what's expected rarely gets appreciated. Over time, your presence becomes less of a heartbeat and more of a hum, steady, but easily ignored. But the moment you step back, genuinely, not performatively, the energy shifts. Silence replaces dialogue, space replaces effort, and suddenly what was once background noise becomes noticeably missing. For the avoidant, this is a jolt to the system. They're not used to emotional availability being withdrawn, especially not without conflict. You're not punishing them, you're just not available in the same way. And that's where the psychological gears start turning. They begin to ask questions they didn't expect to ask. Why is it so quiet? What changed? Where did the emotional safety net go? They feel the void you've left, not because you vanished in anger, but because you exited with peace. And for someone whose nervous system is wired to run from closeness, that kind of silence isn't just quiet, it's disarming. It challenges their entire internal script. You're no longer fitting into the role they expected, the one who stays, the one who waits, the one who absorbs. This absence isn't manipulation. It's not coldness. It's not weaponized silence. It's dignified detachment. It's rooted in a recognition of your value, a deep inner knowing that your worth doesn't need to be proven through endless emotional labor. You're not trying to trigger guilt. You're reclaiming your center. There's a vast difference between stepping back to protect your peace and stepping away to provoke a reaction. One comes from healing, the other comes from hurt. And what makes this kind of silence magnetic is that it isn't loud, it isn't forced, it simply is. And in that space, something even more important happens. You begin to change. You begin to remember who you were before your identity became entangled in chasing emotional security. The chaos of waiting for a message, a shift, a response, fades. You rebuild a relationship with the one person who has always needed your attention the most. You. Your nervous system stops bracing. Your mind begins to clear. You start to see how much of your self-worth was hanging on their inconsistency, and you choose to release it. And ironically, that's where your influence begins. Not through persuasion, not through proving, but through presence. Your absence now says what your words never could. I love myself too much to keep shrinking for someone else's comfort. That kind of clarity is rare. And for the avoidant, it's destabilizing in all the right ways. Because now, they're the ones who have to sit with what they avoided. Now, the silence becomes a mirror. It's in that mirror that real reflection happens, not because you begged for it, but because your energy stopped feeding the pattern. This is where the cycle breaks. Not with a bang, but with a quiet, grounded decision to walk away from what steals your peace. And that kind of silence, it speaks volumes. True influence in a relationship doesn't come from convincing or controlling someone. It comes from a shift in energy. When your emotional state moves from anxious desperation to calm detachment, the dynamic between you and the avoidant partner begins to quietly transform. You're no longer trying to make them come closer. Instead, your absence begins to speak in a way your presence never could. It causes them to feel something unexpected, not pressure, but awareness. Awareness of what they once overlooked. Awareness of your presence, your care, your worth. Sometimes it's not the words you say that change the relationship, it's the words you stop saying. It's the texts you stop sending, the validation you stop offering. In the quiet that follows your withdrawal, a space is created, and that space is filled with your self-respect. That space becomes the mirror in which they finally see you clearly. This isn't just feel-good psychology, it's a neurological reality. Especially in anxious-avoidant dynamics, there's often an unspoken contract. One partner keeps reaching, the other keeps retreating. That push-pull becomes the glue holding the dysfunction together. But when the anxious partner no longer plays their part, when they stop chasing and start choosing peace over panic, something powerful happens. The contract breaks. Self-respect doesn't beg. It doesn't plead. It doesn't over-explain. It doesn't perform. It quietly exits the dynamic that no longer honors its value. That kind of departure isn't about revenge, it's about reclamation. And the avoidant, used to emotional access without emotional effort, begins to feel the absence in a different way, not as punishment, but as disruption. The silence becomes louder than any confrontation ever could. They start asking, why aren't they chasing anymore? And that question becomes the spark of internal reflection. Not always instantly, not always obviously, but often deeply. And that's the paradox. When you stop trying to be seen, that's often when you finally are. Because now, you're not engaging to prove your worth, you're embodying it. And that subtle shift, that's where transformation begins, not just in them, but in you. There comes a moment when your absence starts to echo louder than your presence ever did. Not because you raised your voice, but because you withdrew your energy. That's when the avoidant is forced, maybe for the first time, to truly reevaluate the role you played in their life. Not as someone who begged for affection, but as someone who showed up, consistently, quietly, lovingly, until you didn't. What they once dismissed as neediness starts to look like loyalty. What they once framed as emotional intensity now feels like genuine connection. But here's the truth. None of that clarity emerges while you're still giving, still proving, still pouring into an empty space. The shift only happens when you start honoring yourself enough to stop. This isn't manipulation, it's alignment. When you begin operating from self-respect instead of fear, the entire dynamic recalibrates. You no longer fight for a seat at their table. You simply hold space for the kind of love that meets you where you are without needing to chase it down or beg it to see you. And ironically, that's often when the avoidant begins to return, not because you tried harder, but because you finally stopped. Not because they completed you, but because you remembered you were whole without them. Your self-worth becomes a mirror, and in that reflection they are confronted not by guilt, but by gravity, the weight of what's been lost, or what still could be. So if you've chosen to walk away, not from bitterness, but from clarity, know this: your silence isn't empty. It's powerful. And sometimes it's the only language that can reach someone who's built their life on emotional distance. Silence disrupts patterns, and in attachment dynamics, especially where avoidance meets anxiety, that disruption is electric, because suddenly the familiar chase is missing, the pattern breaks, and when something breaks, the brain takes notice. It scans, it searches, it questions. Where did they go? Why aren't they trying anymore? And that inner disturbance awakens something primal, not panic, but desire. Not control, but curiosity. Avoidants rely on emotional distance to feel in control. To them, intimacy often feels like danger disguised as closeness. They don't pull away because they feel nothing. They pull away because they fear being consumed. And so they build walls, not out of apathy, but as a form of protection. But those walls only hold when they're the ones dictating the distance. The moment you step back on your own terms, the structure shakes, and in the silence that follows, something new begins. When you, the more emotionally invested partner, choose to step back, not out of spite, not to manipulate, but from a place of calm clarity, something subtle but powerful shifts. It's not a withdrawal in anger. It's not silence laced with expectation. It's stillness rooted in self-respect. And that stillness does something your words never could. It forces the avoidant to finally sit with the ambiguity they've long been comfortable projecting onto you. Suddenly, the emotional fog they created no longer shields them. It surrounds them. And for the first time, they may begin to feel the weight of the disconnection, not through conflict, but through your absence. Here's the thing: predictability is comforting, but not compelling. As long as you're constantly reaching out, explaining yourself, checking in, they know what to expect. They know you'll show up, even when they push you away. But when you stop, when you truly go quiet, not from punishment, but from peace, it leaves them with no emotional map. That uncertainty unsettles the avoidant psyche more than confrontation ever could. Why? Because desire at its root feeds on uncertainty. We rarely long for what feels guaranteed. We long for what feels close, but just beyond reach. So when your consistent presence disappears, questions begin to arise that never needed asking before. Do they still care? Did I lose them? Was their love real? Have they moved on? These questions don't emerge when you're explaining yourself. They emerge in the quiet. And that quiet, ironically, is often the only language the avoidant nervous system truly hears. But let's be very clear, this is not about playing games. This isn't a performance or a ploy to spark jealousy. It's not about withholding love to punish. It's about reclaiming your energy and letting your lack of engagement speak the truth. You are no longer available for patterns that reduce you. In that silence, you're setting a boundary, not with anger, but with dignity. And that dignity becomes the most powerful invitation of all. If they care, they'll feel it. If they don't, your silence becomes your clarity. What many people don't realize is that direct emotional conversations, while essential in secure relationships, can feel overwhelming for someone with an avoidant pattern. The more you push, the more they retreat. But when you remove the emotional noise, when you stop chasing and start choosing your own peace, the dynamic changes completely. The silence forces them to listen, not to you, but to themselves. And that's often the scariest thing of all for someone who's built their emotional identity on avoidance. Suddenly, the walls they once leaned on begin to shake, not because you tried to tear them down, but because you stopped pushing against them. And that void where you used to be, that's where they begin to feel what they've worked so hard to avoid: their own vulnerability, their own longing, their own regret. So if you're sitting there wondering, does my silence even matter? I want you to hear this clearly. Yes, it does. Your silence, when it comes from strength, not fear, is not passive. It's the loudest declaration of self-worth you can possibly make. And within that space, something beautiful can happen. Not manipulation, not revenge, but clarity, growth, even desire, because uncertainty births curiosity. And curiosity, when met with self-awareness, has the power to change everything. One of the most toxic patterns in anxious-avoidant dynamics is the emotional imbalance, where one partner carries all the weight of maintaining connection, calming the chaos, and doing the emotional labor. But when that ends, when you no longer hold up both sides of the relationship, you stop enabling the dynamic and you start transforming it quietly, powerfully, and in your silence, you finally become heard. In the end, the power of silence isn't about retreating, it's about realignment. When you stop chasing what no longer nourishes you, you begin attracting what truly sees and values you. We've explored how stepping back from an avoidant dynamic without anger, without blame, can trigger not only introspection in the other person, but healing in yourself. Because real transformation doesn't come from forcing someone to change. It comes from choosing not to abandon yourself in the process. If this message resonated with you, take a moment to reflect. Where in your life have you been giving too much, explaining too often, or waiting too long for someone to notice your worth? Maybe now is the time to stop proving and start being. Because the moment you choose self-respect over approval is the moment everything begins to shift. Thank you so much for spending this time with me. Your presence here means more than you know. If you found value in this video, please consider subscribing to the channel. It's a small action that helps us grow this community of healing and awareness. And I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below and share your thoughts, your story, or what part of this message spoke to your heart. Until next time, honor your peace, protect your energy, and always remember, you are worthy, even in silence.